Rain hammered the windshield, blurring the neon sign of the motel. I saw the shadow first, then the face, pale, furious, pressed against my passenger window. His knuckles were white on the door handle. I turned to look at her, and her eyes were just, hollow. It started on a Wednesday. It was always a Wednesday. For a man who lives his life by mile markers and load schedules, Wednesdays had become a different kind of anchor. Not a destination on a map, but a pocket of time that didn't belong to the road, or the company, or the endless stretch of asphalt. It belonged to her. I'd pull my Freightliner Cascadia into the back corner of a sprawling park-and-ride lot off I-57 in southern Illinois, near a town that was little more than a post office and a feed store. I'd kill the engine, and the sudden silence would be louder than the diesel roar that had been my world for the last 10 hours, sometimes more. The world would go quiet except for the ticking of the cooling metal and the slow, steady hiss of the air brakes releasing their grip. It was the sound of the rig taking a long, slow breath after a hard run. Then I'd wait. Sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 20. I'd lean back in the worn leather of my captain's chair, the seat molded to the shape of my body after 2 million miles of watching the world go by. I'd sip my lukewarm gas station coffee from a stained thermos, the taste as familiar and uninspiring as the sunrise. From my perch, high above the ground, I'd watch the cars of commuters, people living lives I couldn't really imagine anymore. They'd pull in, lock their doors, and carpool into the city, their days governed by clocks on a wall instead of a logbook. They had straight lines and predictable curves. My life was a jagged scribble across the map of the United States, a mess of ink connecting places I'd been to but never really known. Then she'd appear. A modest, 10-year-old sedan, a beige so bland it was almost camouflage, would pull in a few spots down. The driver's door would open, and Sarah would get out. Sarah. She looked like she'd just stepped out of a church service, which, I'd come to learn, wasn't far from the truth. She always wore a simple dress, the kind with little flowers on it, and sensible shoes that looked comfortable but joyless. Her hair, the color of autumn leaves just before they fall, was pinned up neatly, but a few strands always managed to escape, catching the flat afternoon light around her face like a reluctant halo. She never wore much makeup, just enough to hide the fact she probably hadn't slept well, a faint dusting of powder over the shadows under her eyes. The first time she did it, I nearly had a heart attack. It was a blistering hot August afternoon, the heat shimmering off the asphalt in waves that made the distant trees wobble. I was just sitting there, logbook open on my lap, trying to make the numbers add up, trying to find a creative way to explain why I was 3 hours behind schedule thanks to a shutdown on I-80 outside Joliet. Suddenly, this woman walks right up to my cab, purposeful as a state trooper with a quota to fill. She didn't hesitate. She just stopped below my window and looked up, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. "Are you Sam McCarty?" she'd asked, her voice quiet but clear, not a speck of fear in it. It carried over the distant hum of the interstate. "I'm a private man. My name on the side of the door is a professional courtesy, a DOT requirement, not an invitation for a chat." I cracked the window just enough to talk, the hot, heavy air rushing in, thick with the smell of diesel and baked asphalt. "Depends who's a skin. My name is Sarah. I was told you drive east on Wednesdays. To Indianapolis, sometimes farther." I eyed her. She didn't look like a cop, or a lot lizard, or anyone who had any business being at a truck stop. She looked like someone who organized bake sales and worried about library fines. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was she from a collection agency? A relative of someone I'd pissed off in a bar 20 years ago? You stay on the road this long, you collect debts you don't even remember incurring. Some of them are monetary. Others are just ghosts waiting for you at the next exit. And "I'd like to ride with you," she said, plain as day. "Just to the state line. I'll pay for your fuel." I just stared at her. The request was so absurd it short-circuited my brain. A woman like that, wanting to ride in a big rig. It made no sense. This cab is my office, my kitchen, my bedroom. It's a self-contained world of solitude. I have a strict rule, no riders. It's a company rule, sure, but it's my rule, too. Writers mean complications. They mean talk when you want silence. They mean witnessing things you don't want to witness. They ask questions you don't want to answer. They leave a scent behind that lingers for days, a reminder that your solitude was breached. "Ma'am, this ain't a taxi service." "I know," she said. Her eyes, I noticed then, were a deep, tired green. Like a forest after a long rain. They held my gaze, and there was no game in them, no angle. Just a quiet, bone-deep weariness that I recognized like an old song on the radio. I just need to be somewhere else. For a few hours. Something in the way she said it, it wasn't a request, it was a plea. I've been on the road for over 20 years, seen 2 million miles of this country, and if there's one thing you learn, it's how to read the desperation in people's eyes. It's a universal language. I saw it in the eyes of a kid in a Texas bus station once, trying to get away from a bad situation at home. He couldn't have been more than 16, clutching a worn-out backpack like it was a life raft. I gave him $50 and told him which bus to get on to head north. Never knew what happened to him. I saw it in my own reflection a few times, in greasy truck stop mirrors at 3 a.m., back after the divorce in 14, when the silence in the cab was so total it felt like I'd died and nobody had told me. Her eyes had that same look. A quiet scream. So I did something I never do. I broke my own rule. Maybe it was her eyes. Maybe it was the memory of that kid in Texas. Maybe I was just tired of my own company. "Get in," I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. I thumbed the lock on the passenger door, the click echoing in the quiet cab. She climbed up with a practiced grace that surprised me, not fumbling on the steps like most first-timers. She settled into the passenger seat like she belonged there. She didn't. The cab of a truck is a lonely kingdom, a working space. It smells of stale coffee, diesel, road dust, and whatever cheap pine tree air freshener I grabbed at the last fuel stop. Sarah, she smelled like lavender and rain. It was a strange, clean contrast that made my whole world feel a little grimy, a little more lived in than I was comfortable with. She buckled her seatbelt, placed her purse primly on her lap, and stared straight ahead through the vast expanse of the windshield, her hands folded on top of the bag. "Thank you," she whispered, so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the low idle of the engine. And I put the truck in gear, released the brakes with a loud sigh of air, and we rolled out onto the interstate, the beginning of our strange Wednesday ritual. The first few rides were quiet. Eerily so. She just watched the world go by. The blur of trees, the other trucks lumbering along like prehistoric beasts, the small towns that evaporated in the rearview mirror before you could even read their names. There's a rhythm to driving a semi, a hypnotic hum of the tires on the pavement, the steady thrum of the engine that vibrates right up through the floor into your bones. It can put you in a trance if you let it. For her, it seemed to be a kind of medicine. I'd watch her out of the corner of my eye. I'd see the tension in her shoulders, which were drawn up tight around her ears when she first got in, slowly dissolve, mile by mile. The neat bun would get a little looser. She'd rest her head against the cool glass of the window, her breath fogging a small patch of it. It was like the truck was a decompression chamber, slowly, carefully releasing the pressure of her real life, whatever that was. Once, we got stuck in a dead-stop traffic jam outside of Indianapolis. A bad wreck up ahead. All lanes closed. For 2 hours, we sat there, surrounded by a sea of silent cars and idling trucks. The sun beat down. Most people would get antsy, frustrated. They'd start honking, or fiddling with their phones. Sarah just seemed peaceful. She watched a hawk circling high above a cornfield, its wings catching the thermals. "He's got the best view of all," she said, her voice soft. "No traffic up there." It was one of the first things she'd said that wasn't a direct response to a question from me. It made me realize she wasn't just escaping something, she was seeking something. A different perspective. From the ground, we were all stuck. From up there, we were just a line of colored metal on a gray ribbon, a temporary problem in a vast landscape. We didn't talk about her real life. Not at first. It was an unspoken agreement. We talked about the road. I found myself pointing out landmarks only a trucker would know, a diner in Indiana with a waitress named Flo who'd been pouring coffee for 40 years and could balance 6 plates on one arm, a stretch of I-70 in Ohio where the fog rolls in off the field so thick you feel like you're driving through milk, your headlights just swallowed by the white, a particular bridge in West Virginia that sings a low, mournful note when the wind hits it just right. She was a good listener. She'd ask questions. Not nosy questions, but curious ones. About the truck, how many gears does it really have? The logistics, how do you know where to sleep? And the loneliness. Do you ever get tired of it? She asked one afternoon, somewhere in eastern Ohio, the sun setting behind us and painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple that looked like a bruise. Tired of the road? I grunted, downshifting for a slight grade. The engine brake growled its deep, guttural complaint. Every day. But I get more tired of staying still. It was the truest thing I knew about myself. The divorce had proved that. My ex-wife, Brenda, she wanted stillness. She wanted a garden, a 2-car garage, neighbors you could borrow sugar from. I gave it to her for a while, or I tried to. But sitting on that porch swing felt like being in a cage. I'd watch the planes overhead and feel a jealousy so sharp it was like a physical pain. Brenda said I loved the road more than I loved her. Maybe she was right. Maybe I just didn't know how to love something that didn't have a vanishing point. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sky met the dark silhouette of the trees. It's the same view, but it's always changing. That's it exactly, I said, surprised she'd put it into words so well. That was the paradox of it. The highway is always the same strip of concrete, but the light, the weather, the thoughts in your head, they're never the same twice. It was during our 4th or 5th trip that she told me about the church choir. She'd been humming a hymn, something soft and sad that I couldn't place. I recognized the melody from one of the few times my mother managed to drag me to church back in Oklahoma when I was a kid, me fidgeting in a starched collar that was too tight, wishing I was outside with a wrench in my hand, helping my dad with an engine block. You sing? I asked, keeping my tone casual. She blushed, a faint pink rising in her cheeks that made her look younger, less burdened. A little. I'm in the choir at our church. Second soprano. And just like that, a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The dresses, the neat hair, the faint scent of lavender soap. She was a church lady. A good, respectable, small-town woman. And here she was, every Wednesday, secretly riding shotgun in a semi-truck with a stranger, crossing state lines under a false premise. The contradiction was jarring, like seeing a field of wildflowers growing up through a crack in a concrete loading dock. What do you tell people? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. When you're gone for 6, 7 hours. She didn't look at me. She just watched the fields of corn blurring past, the stalks standing in perfect, silent rows, a million green soldiers standing at attention. I have an aunt in Terre Haute. She's been unwell. For a long time. The lie was so practiced, so smooth. It rolled off her tongue without a single tremor. It told me more than the truth ever could have. It told me this wasn't a new thing for her, this need to escape. The truck was just a new method. The lie was old. It was a well-worn tool she kept sharp and ready. Her husband's name was David. She mentioned him once, in passing, like he was a feature of the weather. He was a deacon at the same church. A good man, she said. A pillar of their small community. The word sounded rehearsed, like a line from a play she'd performed 1,000 times. But whenever her phone would buzz from inside her purse, a sound that was always jarring in the mechanical symphony of the cab, she'd jump like she'd been shocked. A quick, furtive glance at the screen, a press of a button to silence it, and then her hand would rest on the purse, as if to keep whatever was inside from getting out. The calls came like clockwork. One around 3 p.m. Another around 5. A silent, digital check-in. I never saw a picture of him, never heard his voice, but I could feel his presence in the cab with us. He was the silence after she silenced her phone. He was the reason she checked her watch every 15 minutes as we got closer to the drop-off point. He was the pressure she was decompressing from. I've met men like David before. Not him, specifically, but his type. The ones who are pillars of the community in public and something else entirely behind closed doors. The ones who build cages out of good intentions and moral superiority. My ex-wife's father was a bit like that. Always talking about family, about duty, about what was proper. He had a way of making you feel like you were letting him down just by breathing wrong. He once told me that a man who can't stay in one place can't be trusted. I think what he really meant was that a man he couldn't control couldn't be trusted. It's a quiet kind of violence, the kind that doesn't leave a scar like the one on my jaw I got in that Texas bar fight over a spilled beer and a misunderstanding. It leaves a different kind of mark, one on the inside, where no one can see it, a slow erosion of the soul until you don't recognize yourself anymore. One rainy Wednesday, the wipers slapping a frantic, uneven rhythm against the glass, she was quieter than usual. The green in her eyes looked darker, stormier. The whole world outside the windows was gray and weeping. "Everything all right, Sarah?" I finally asked, my voice a low rumble under the sound of the rain and the tires hissing on the wet pavement. She took a deep, shaky breath, the kind you take when you're trying to keep from falling apart. "David, he's been asking more questions about Aunt Carol. Wants to know which hospital she's in. Wants to drive up with me next week to visit her." The air in the cab went cold. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was it. The end of the line. The beautiful, impossible lie was fraying at the edges. "What did you tell him?" "I told him she was in a private care facility, and they're very strict about visitors because of the flu season." It was a stupid thing to say. She ran a hand over her face, her fingers trembling. "I'm a terrible liar, Sam." "You're doing all right so far," I said, trying for a bit of humor, but it fell flat, swallowed by the tension in the cab. The lie wasn't the problem. The problem was that the lie was starting to fall apart, and I had a sick feeling about what would be exposed when it did. It was the same feeling I had in my gut right before my friend Danny disappeared on that run to Laredo. He'd called me from a payphone, said the guy who hired him was twitchy. I told him to drop the load. "No paycheck is worth your life," I'd said. He'd laughed it off. I never pushed. I just said, "Be careful." A week later, his rig was found empty. I learned then that, "be careful," is a useless thing to say to someone who's already in too deep. "Maybe this is the last time," she said, her voice barely a whisper, directed at the rain-streaked window. "Maybe I shouldn't do this anymore." I felt a pang of something I didn't want to name. It wasn't just losing my Wednesday companion. It was the thought of her going back into that pressure cooker for good, with no release valve. The thought of her shoulders staying tense forever, of that tired green in her eyes losing its last bit of light. "That's your call, Sarah," I said, keeping my eyes on the road, on the endless parade of red taillights ahead of me. "This is your ride." She was quiet for a long time after that. The rain let up as we crossed into Indiana. The sun broke through the clouds in dramatic fashion, sending down shafts of light that made the wet asphalt steam and glitter. It was one of those moments on the road that feels holy, for lack of a better word. A reminder that even after the worst storm, the light finds a way through. "Can I ask you something personal, Sam?" she said suddenly, her voice clear in the now quiet cab. "Shoot. That picture. The one you keep folded in your sun visor. Who is she?" I flinched. It was an involuntary reaction, a tightening in my chest, but she saw it. I knew she did. I hadn't looked at that picture in months, maybe a year, but I knew exactly how it felt in my fingers, the creases worn soft with time. A woman with wind-blown dark hair, squinting against the sun, standing in front of a backdrop of mountains that were too big for the sky. Montana. It reminded me of another woman, another secret. Her name was Clara. She wasn't escaping a husband, but something just as binding. A family, a ranch, a legacy she never asked for. I met her one summer when I was hauling livestock feed up to the high country. It was a good run, taking me off the interstate and onto two-lane roads that wound through valleys and over passes where the air was thin and clean. We had a few weeks. It wasn't like this thing with Sarah. It was different. More intense. We both knew it had an expiration date stamped on it from the first night we shared a beer at the one bar in her tiny town. I remember one evening, we were sitting by the Gallatin River, the water so clear and cold you could count the stones on the bottom. The sun was going down behind the Spanish peaks, turning them purple and pink. I asked her why she didn't just leave. She talked about wanting to see the ocean, but she'd never been east of the Dakotas. Sell her share of the ranch, I'd said. See the world. She'd picked up a smooth, flat stone and skipped it across the water. It bounced 7 times before sinking into the deep green current. Some people aren't owned by other people, Sam, she'd said, not looking at me. They're owned by the land. By the history. This place, it's in my bones. Leaving would be like tearing out my own skeleton. She was right. A few weeks later, my contract was up and I was rolling east out of Billings with a load of lumber, and she was just a memory and a folded photograph in my visor. She was trapped, same as Sarah. Just a different kind of cage. One made of mountains and duty instead of floral print dresses and a deacon husband. The photo was from our last day. We'd driven up a logging road as high as we could go, and she just stood there, looking out over her whole world. She was smiling, but it was the same sad smile I saw on Sarah sometimes. The smile of someone who knows what freedom looks like but can never quite touch it. I glanced over at Sarah. Her question was still hanging in the air, patient and quiet. She's a woman I knew in Montana, I said, my voice rough. A long time ago. Was she YU? Sarah trailed off, gesturing vaguely with her hand, as if to encompass my whole life. The truck, the road, the solitude. No, I said, maybe too quickly. No. My life was like this long before I met her. And long after. I thought of my ex-wife, Brenda, standing in the doorway of our empty house after the movers had left. Is this it, Sam? She'd asked. You just leave? I didn't have an answer for her then, and I didn't have one now. The divorce wasn't about another woman. It was about this. The road. The miles. The person I become when I'm behind the wheel. The person I stop being when I'm not. My ex-wife wanted the man who came home at night. She didn't know what to do with the ghost who was already thinking about the next 1,000 miles. She looks happy in the picture, Sarah said quietly, accepting my non-answer. It was a good day, I admitted, and the memory of it was so sharp it was almost painful. The smell of pine, the thin mountain air, the quiet between us that wasn't empty. We drove on in a new kind of silence. Not the comfortable silence from before, but one filled with ghosts. My ghost from Montana, and her ever-present one from back home in Illinois. When I dropped her back at the park and ride that evening, the sun was low, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement that made the empty parking spaces look like graves. Sam, she said, her hand on the door handle, hesitating. Thank you. For everything. Be careful, Sarah, I said. It was all I could offer. It felt weak and useless, just like it had with Danny. Next Wednesday, she asked, a hopeful tremor in her voice, her eyes searching mine. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it felt like an eternity. This was getting complicated. This was a straight line to a bad place. I knew it in my gut, the same way I know when a storm is coming by the color of the sky. But I saw the look in her eyes. The thought of saying no, of closing that door for her for good, felt like a cruelty I wasn't capable of. It felt like siding with the cage. I'll be here, I said. The next Wednesday, she was late. 15 minutes turned into 30. 30 turned into 45. I drank my coffee, then I drank the cold dregs. I watched the commuters come and go. I was starting to get a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. The kind of feeling you get when you see state troopers ahead and you know you're a few pounds overweight. I thought about just leaving. Calling it a day. Maybe this was her way of ending it. Just not showing up. It would be cleaner that way. But I stayed. I thought of my friend, Danny, again. Of that last phone call. The regret of not being more forceful, of not screaming at him to just walk away from the truck, the money be damned. I've learned since then that when your gut tells you to wait, you wait. When it tells you something's wrong, you listen. My gut was telling me this wasn't just a no-show. This was something else. Finally, her beige sedan whipped into the lot, taking the turn too fast, parking crookedly over the white line. She practically ran to the truck, her face pale, her hair coming undone from its neat bun. A few strands were stuck to her cheek, wet with either sweat or tears. She scrambled up into the cab, breathless, slamming the door behind her. He knows, she gasped, her chest heaving. He doesn't know, but he knows. Whoa, slow down, I said, my voice calm and steady, a counterpoint to her panic. I handed her the bottle of water I always kept on the dash. Breathe. What happened? She took a long drink, her hand shaking so much that water sloshed onto her dress, leaving a dark spot on the floral pattern. David. He asked me this morning why the mileage on the car was so high if I was just going to Terre Haute and back. He'd been checking the odometer, Sam. Writing it down in a little book he keeps in his desk drawer. My blood ran cold. This was a new level of control. Not just suspicion, but investigation. Cold, methodical, calculated. It was the act of an auditor, not a husband. He said he was worried about me, she continued, her voice laced with a bitter irony that was chilling. Worried about the car breaking down on such a long trip. He said maybe he should follow me next time, just to make sure I get there safe. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a trapped animal panic. He was smiling when he said it, Sam. That awful, calm, patient smile. I knew that smile. It was the smile of a man who holds all the cards, who knows he's already won the game before it's even started. We can't do this anymore, she said, tears finally welling up in her eyes and spilling down her pale cheeks. She wiped at them angrily with the back of her hand. I'm so sorry. I've put you in a terrible position. Don't be sorry, I said, my voice firm. You got nothing to be sorry for. I put the truck in gear, the engine rumbling to life. I felt a surge of defiance. A stubborn anger on her behalf. But you're right. This is done. But not today. Today, we drive. One last time. She looked at me, confused, her tear-streaked face a question mark. What? One last ride, I repeated, my decision hardening with every word. My dispatch had me on a loose schedule. The load wasn't due in Columbus until Friday morning. I had time. We'll go farther than usual. We'll go clear across Ohio. We'll have dinner at a real diner, not just a truck stop. We'll make it a good one. It was reckless. It was stupid. I knew it. But I couldn't stand the thought of her last memory of this being fear and tears in a park-and-ride lot. I wanted her to have one more memory of freedom, of the road unfolding before her, before she went back to her cage for good. I wanted to overwrite the fear with one last good day. It was a selfish impulse, maybe. A grand gesture that wouldn't fix anything. But sometimes a useless gesture is all you've got. She looked at me, a tear tracing a path through the light dusting of powder on her cheek. And she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. That drive was different. It was charged with a kind of desperate, final energy. A farewell tour. We talked more than we ever had before, the words spilling out of her as if she knew she wouldn't get another chance. She told me about her childhood on a small farm, about wanting to be a botanist, about how she could name all the local wildflowers by their Latin names. She spoke of Lobelia cardinalis dash, the cardinal flower, and Asclepias tuberosa dash, the butterfly weed. She described them with a passion that made her face light up. She told me how she met David at a church social when she was 19, how he was handsome and charming and all the mothers thought he was the perfect match. She spoke of her life like it was a story that had been written for her by someone else, a story she was just acting out, hitting her marks. I found myself talking, too. I told her about growing up in Oklahoma, about the endless sky and the feeling of wanting to know what was on the other side of the horizon. I even told her about my brother, something I never talk about. He was the smart one, I said, surprising myself with the words as they came out. The cab felt safe, a confessional booth rolling at 70 miles an hour. The one who was supposed to get out. College scholarships, the whole deal. I was the grease monkey, supposed to take over my dad's garage. But he got tangled up with the wrong people, bad news. Owed money to guys who didn't write things down in little books. And one day, it all got flipped upside down. He left town in the middle of the night, a note on the kitchen table. And I was the one who ended up leaving a few years later, just in a different direction. Never knew which was worse, running toward something or just running away. The memory was sharp. My dad's face, gray and slack, when he found the note. The shame I felt, because a part of me was jealous that my brother had broken free, no matter how messy it was. I hit the road a few years after that, not because I had to, but because the whole town felt like it was looking at me, waiting for me to fail, too. It was the most I'd said to anyone about him in 10 years. Sharing that piece of myself with her felt significant. Like I was balancing the scales. She'd shown me her secret world, so I showed her a corner of mine. She just listened, her green eyes full of a deep, sad understanding that didn't need words. Night fell as we crossed the Ohio line. The world outside the cab became a black void punctuated by the distant, lonely lights of farmhouses. The hum of the tires was a constant comfort, the only sound in the world. "I'm hungry," she said, and it was the most normal, simple thing she'd said all day. It broke the spell of confession and memory. I smiled, a real smile. "I know a place." I pulled off the highway at an exit that promised nothing but a gas station and a motel. The motel was a single-story, L-shaped affair called the Starlight Inn, with a flickering neon sign that had a few letters burned out, so it read SRLGHT Inn. It looked like 1,000 other motels I'd passed in my life. Places full of lonely stories and questionable hygiene. Next to it was a 24-hour diner, glowing like a beacon in the dark, a refuge for the sleepless and the transient. "Best meatloaf in the state," I said. "Or so I've heard." We ate in a worn vinyl booth that was cracked and repaired with silver duct tape. The coffee was bitter and strong, just how I like it. The meatloaf was decent. Sarah ordered apple pie for dessert, with a scoop of vanilla ice cream, and ate it slowly, savoring every single bite as if she were memorizing the taste. For an hour, we were just two people sharing a meal. A trucker and a woman with tired eyes. No secrets, no husbands, no disappearing friends. Just the clatter of cutlery, the low murmur of the other late-night patrons, a family with sleeping kids, two other truckers talking shop, and the quiet hiss of the coffee machine. It was a perfect, ordinary hour, and because we both knew it was the last, it felt extraordinary. When we left, the air had grown cold. A light rain was beginning to fall, misting our faces as we walked across the parking lot. "Well," I said, standing by the door of my truck, the moment I'd been dreading finally here. "The magic hour was over. Indianapolis is a 3-hour drive from here. We should get you back." She looked from the truck to the motel. The flickering sign cast a pale, intermittent glow on her face, making her look like a ghost. "Can we just wait a little while?" she asked, her voice small. "The thought of going back right now, it's too much." I understood. The transition from the freedom of the road back to the cage was the hardest part. It was like coming up for air too fast. The bends would cripple you. "All right," I said. "We can sit in the cab for a bit. Wait for the rain to let up." So we climbed back into the familiar world of the Freightliner. I didn't start the engine. We just sat there in the dark, in the far corner of the motel parking lot, the rain starting to come down harder, drumming a soft, steady beat on the roof. It was peaceful. A bubble of silence in the vast, dark night. "I'm going to miss this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The view. It's so big from up here. You can see everything." "Yeah," I said, looking out at the rain-streaked lot, the neon lights of the diner bleeding across the wet pavement. "Big old world out there." "Thank you, Sam," she said. "For letting me see it." For not asking questions. Nothin' to thank me for. We sat in silence for another minute. A comfortable, final silence. I was about to reach for the key, to break the spell and start the long drive back, when I saw it. A flicker of movement near the motel office. A shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the building's overhang. It moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose across the wet pavement, straight toward my truck. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a man. Tall, dressed in a dark jacket. He walked right into the glow of a parking lot lamp, and his face became clear. He wasn't looking around. He was looking directly at us. "Sarah," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Do you know him?" She followed my gaze. All the color drained from her face. She made a small, choked sound, a gasp of air that the cab seemed to steal. "Oh, God," she whispered. "David." It was him. The deacon. The pillar of the community. And he was here. In the middle of nowhere, Ohio. In the rain. He hadn't followed us. He couldn't have. We'd been on back roads, I'd made unpredictable turns. He must have tracked her. The phone. Or a GPS tracker on the car. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. This was premeditated. This was a hunter finding his prey. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He just walked steadily toward the passenger side of the cab, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The calm, patient smile she described was gone. This was something else. Something much worse. This was the face of a man whose property was misbehaving. He yanked on the handle. It was locked. He banged his fist on the window, a single, sharp, cracking sound that made both of us jump. "Sarah," he said. His voice was muffled by the glass and the rain. But it was terrifyingly calm. A predator's calm. "Open the door." Sarah was frozen, a statue of pure fear. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. My own instincts were screaming. 20 years of roadhouse bars, shady loading docks, and sketchy rest stops had honed a certain survival instinct in me. My hand moved toward the tire iron I keep wedged between my seat and the console. It was heavy and cold. The scar on my jaw throbbed with a phantom ache, a ghost of that fight in Texas. I could be out of that cab in 2 seconds. I was bigger than him. I outweighed him by a good 50 pounds of road-weary muscle. I could end this. I could feel the ghost of the punch I'd thrown, the crunch of bone, the hot flash of adrenaline. I could do it again. But I looked at Sarah's face. And I knew that if I did that, if I escalated this to violence, I would be making it 1,000 times worse for her. This wasn't a bar fight over a spilled beer. This was something uglier, more complicated. My brand of problem-solving would only pour gasoline on the fire. He would take it out on her later, in private, where the walls have no windows. This man, with his calm fury, he wasn't afraid of a fight. He was afraid of losing control. A public brawl would be a loss of control he would never forgive. And she would pay the price. "Sarah," David said again, his voice rising just a fraction, a crack in the icy calm. "Now." Slowly, like a sleepwalker in a nightmare, Sarah reached out a trembling hand and unlocked the door. He pulled it open, letting in a gust of wind and rain that felt like a violation. He didn't look at me. He didn't even seem to register my existence. His eyes were locked on his wife. "Get out of the truck," he commanded, his voice low and flat. She didn't move. She just stared at him, her face a blank mask of shock and resignation. I said, "Get out." He reached in, his hand shooting out like a snake, and grabbed her by the upper arm. He pulled. It wasn't a violent yank, but it was firm, undeniable. The kind of pull you use on a stubborn animal. "Hey," I said, my voice a low growl. I couldn't help it. The word escaped before I could stop it. "Let go of her." For the first time, David's eyes flicked to me. There was no fear in them. No anger. Just a kind of dismissive contempt. Like I was a piece of furniture, an irrelevant part of the scenery he was about to rearrange. "This doesn't concern you," he said, his gaze returning to Sarah. "We're leaving." He pulled her again, and she stumbled out of the cab, her sensible shoes slipping on the wet step. He held her arm tightly, his fingers digging into her flesh, steering her away from the truck, toward a dark sedan parked near the office that I hadn't noticed before. She looked back at me over her shoulder. Her face was crumpling, the careful mask of composure shattering into a million pieces. Fear, shame, and a deep, bottomless despair. I wanted to do something. To yell, to fight, to follow. But I was paralyzed. Not by fear for myself, but by the certainty that any action I took would be visited upon her tenfold later, in a place where I couldn't help her. I was a stranger who would be 1,000 miles away by morning. He was her life. Just before he pushed her into the passenger seat of his car, she looked at me one last time. Her lips formed a single word, a silent apology that tore through me. "Sorry." Then she was gone. The car door slammed shut. David got into the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot without a backward glance. The red of his taillights bled into the rain and then vanished onto the highway, heading west. Back toward Illinois. Back to the cage. I sat there for a long, long time. The passenger door was still hanging open. The rain was blowing in, soaking the seat where she had been sitting just minutes before. The scent of lavender was already fading, replaced by the smell of wet asphalt and defeat. I felt a rage so profound it made me shake. A helpless, useless rage that had nowhere to go. It vibrated in my hands, in my chest. I finally reached over and slammed the passenger door shut. The sound was loud and empty in the quiet cab. I had been an idiot. A romantic fool. I had thought I was giving her a few hours of freedom, a glimpse of a different life. But I hadn't. I had just been a participant in her prison break, and we'd been caught. I hadn't helped her escape, I had only made her cage smaller, the walls thicker. David would make sure of that. The odometer, the tracking, he wouldn't let her out of his sight now. My Wednesday rides had cost her whatever small measure of freedom she'd managed to carve out for herself. I started the truck, the diesel engine rumbling to life like a waking beast. I didn't have a load. I was empty, deadheading back to the yard in Illinois. But I didn't turn west. I couldn't. I couldn't drive on the same road as them, couldn't stand the thought of seeing their taillights in the distance. I turned east. I drove all night, pushing the rig harder than I should have. I blew past the speed limit, my hand strangling the steering wheel. I drove through the rest of Ohio, through the dark, sleeping mountains of West Virginia, into the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter, smoky reports, lot lizards, lonely voices looking for a conversation, but it all sounded like it was coming from another planet. I didn't stop for coffee. I didn't stop for fuel. I just drove, trying to put as many miles as possible between me and that motel parking lot. Trying to outrun the image of Sarah's hollow eyes. But you can't outrun a memory. It rides with you, sits in the passenger seat, whispers to you over the hum of the engine. Sometime around 4 a.m., somewhere on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, the exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. My eyes were burning. The white lines on the road started to blur together. I almost nodded off, the truck drifting onto the shoulder, the rumble strip screaming a violent brrraaaapp that jolted me awake. My heart pounded in my throat. I'd almost put myself and 80,000 pounds of steel into a ditch. I pulled off at the next rest area, a bleak, overlit place smelling of diesel and disinfectant. I killed the engine and just sat there, shaking. I couldn't sleep. I just stared at my own reflection in the dark windshield, a tired, old man with a scar on his jaw and too many miles in his eyes. The helplessness I felt was sickeningly familiar. It was the same hollow feeling I'd had for months after they found Danny's empty rig. The feeling of a question you can never answer, a wrong you can never right. The next few weeks were a blur of highways and loading docks. I took every run they offered me, no matter how bad. Denver, Salt Lake, Seattle. I stayed away from the Midwest. Wednesdays came and went. They were just days of the week again, marked by mileage, not by a beige sedan in a park-and-ride lot. I found myself avoiding I-57 in Illinois completely. I took longer routes, burned more fuel, just so I wouldn't have to pass that exit. The back corner of that lot felt haunted. I thought that was the end of the story. A sad, ugly chapter I'd have to carry with me, another ghost to add to the collection. Then, about a month later, I was at a Flying J in western Nebraska, waiting on a new assignment. I was hauling a half-empty load of miscellaneous goods, and the receiver in Cheyenne wasn't ready for me. So I had a day to kill. I was checking my P.O. box, a service I use for mail since I don't have a fixed address. It's mostly junk mail, bills for my insurance, the occasional card from my sister asking when I'm going to settle down, a question that stopped being funny about 10 years ago. I was flipping through the envelopes, about to toss the whole pile, when I saw it. Tucked between a bill and some junk mail was a letter. A simple, white, business-sized envelope. No return address. The postmark was from a town in central Illinois I didn't recognize. My name and P.O. box number were written in a neat, careful script I recognized immediately. My hands, usually steady from years of maneuvering a 40-ton vehicle, were trembling slightly as I tore it open. The paper inside was thin, the kind you find in a cheap notebook. It was from Sarah. The letter was short. Just a single page. Folded twice. Sam. I don't know if this will reach you. I hope it does. I'm sorry for how things ended. I'm sorry for what you saw. There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you. David, he wasn't just tracking my phone that night. He knew about the Wednesdays. Not about you, specifically. But he knew I was gone for hours. He let me do it. We have an arrangement. He calls it my pastoral care visit to Aunt Carol. It was his idea, years ago, after I had a difficult time. He said it was important for a wife to have her own time, to clear her head. So she could be a better wife. A better Christian. It was a gift, he said. An allowance of freedom. As long as I was home for dinner. As long as I answered his calls. As long as the lie was maintained for everyone else. It was a controlled burn. A way to let the pressure off so I would never actually explode. So I would never actually leave. That night, we were late. I didn't answer his calls. I broke the rules of the game. He wasn't angry because I was with a man. He was angry because I was with a man who was showing me that the cage door wasn't just for show. That it could actually open and I could walk through it and not come back. He wasn't jealous of you, Sam. He was terrified of what you represented. Freedom he couldn't control. I don't know when I will be able to write again. Or if I ever will. Thank you for the view from your window. It was the truest thing I've seen in a long time. Be safe on the road. Sarah. I read the letter 3 times, sitting there in the cab of my truck in the middle of Nebraska. The setting sun was casting a long, golden light over the endless fields of corn that stretched to the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of dust and diesel and growing things. And everything shifted. The whole story rearranged itself in my head. I hadn't been her savior. I hadn't been her accomplice. I had been her allowance. An unknowing pawn in a sick, twisted psychological game I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The thought made me feel dirty. Used. My anger at David was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. A cold, clinical disgust. But underneath that was a wave of profound sadness for her, so deep it felt like grief. The cage was so much more intricate, so much more diabolical, than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just a controlling husband. It was a system they had built together, a prison disguised as a kindness. He had given her a long leash, and I was just the stranger at the end of it she'd happened to meet. The confrontation at the motel wasn't about catching her in a lie. It was about reminding her who held the leash. It was a demonstration of power. I replayed it all in my head with this new, terrible clarity. Her practiced lie about the aunt was a script they both knew. Her jumping at the sound of her phone wasn't fear of being caught, but the anxiety of a prisoner checking in with her guard. My "one last ride" wasn't a reckless act of freedom, it was a violation of her parole. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it in my wallet, behind the worn, cracked picture of Clara from Montana. 2 women, 2 different cages, a continent apart. One built of mountains and duty, the other of twisted love and control. Both of them trapped by things you couldn't just break down with your fists or drive away from in a truck. I looked at the empty passenger seat. It seemed bigger now, emptier. The ghost of Sarah was still there, but she looked different. Not just a victim, but a woman playing a long, desperate game with the only cards she'd been dealt. I hoped she would find a way to win. I doubted I would ever know. I started the engine, the familiar roar filling the cab, chasing away the silence. Dispatch had a load for me after all. Plastic piping to Cheyenne. A long haul, mostly at night. Just the way I like it. As I pulled out of the truck stop and onto the on-ramp, the last of the setting sun hit my windshield, and for a moment, the whole world was on fire. I thought about all the people out there, in all those little houses and towns I passed, their windows glowing in the dusk. All the secrets they kept, the quiet wars they fought, the cages they lived in. And I thought about the road, this endless ribbon of asphalt. For me, it was a life. For some, it was a job. For Sarah, it was a glimpse of a world where the door wasn't just for show. Some people get in your cab to get somewhere. Others, they just want to see if the door still opens. Turns out, some doors are built to look like they open, but they're chained to the frame from the other side.